Well, thank you so much for joining us here on Channel 7. I'm joined by French Hill, who has been doing a lot of work in Washington, D.C. for the state of Arkansas. Can you catch us up a little bit? Thank you so much for taking the time to come and let us know what all you've been working on. What's been the biggest issues you've been focused on so far?
You bet. Well, this year so far has been taken up by three enormous issues that were carried over from 2023 and the collapse of governance in the House because of kicking Kevin McCarthy out of the speakership. Finish 2024 spending, reform the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court in the process so that we never have another malfeasance by the FBI around foreign intelligence surveillance, and then finally get this national security package passed that benefits Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, our key allies. And so that was a lot of effort over the past 6 months. I'm glad those things are behind us. I think as we look forward, we're going to be looking at some of the work I've done on digital assets to have a regulatory framework for cryptocurrencies, digital assets, the future of finance and the internet. That's a project I'm in the middle of right now. And then the Farm Bill. Senator Bozeman is our ranking member on agriculture in the Senate. Rick Crawford here in Arkansas, they're very involved in moving a reauthorization of all the farm programs, which we do every 5 years. So those are some of the highlights coming up.
Yeah, I'm sure that spending bill, when it came to Ukraine, was a big challenge. I know there was a lot of going back and forth on that.
Right.
You ultimately voted in favor of that funding for Ukraine. Can you tell us a little bit about how important that is?
Yeah, it's very important. Look, we don't want Putin to win. To have Putin win in Ukraine is bad for the United States. It's bad for our trade and economics between Europe and the United States. It would keep prices high on food and commodities. It would be a real mistake, and you're green-lighting, rewarding an authoritarian dictator. President Obama was not tough enough, in my opinion, on Assad in Syria and Putin in Ukraine. Trump was better, but this was green-lighting a victory for Putin opens up the chance this is going to happen in East Asia, with the Chinese perhaps invading Taiwan or being more aggressive there. It's a place, as I say, to draw the line and tell these authoritarian, mostly communist or terrorist-driven organizations that the Western countries, led by the United States, are not going to put up with it anymore. Europe is doing their part, 2-1 for Americans. We have strong auditing of this funding for Ukraine, and so I'm pleased we got that done. I think it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. Any comments on what's happening with Israel, with the latest attack from Iran to Israel, Israel's response? I know the U.S. has quietly been trying to keep that situation as calm as possible. What's your take on that?
Well, that's again this interconnectivity between this axis of evil that's reasserted itself. China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. They're all interconnected. Iran is backing Russia. Munitions, drones, killing Ukrainians. Iran backs the terrorists in Gaza, the Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria that are attacking Israel. And so that's why this national security package also increased sanctions on Iran, and it's a bad situation. The United States is playing a critical role. Humanitarian aid to Gaza and trying to bring a ceasefire there that keeps being not agreed to by Hamas. I think in this country, Israel's getting a lot of bad press right now with these anti-Semitic, pro-Hamas rallies around the country. But the U.S. is working with the Egyptians, with the Qataris, with the Israelis to try to get the hostages out of Gaza, get humanitarian aid in, and get rid of the terrorist leadership in Gaza. And it's not easy, as we're in our 7th month, so we know it's not easy, but we're working hard at it every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting topic of conversation that's been brought up is the ban on TikTok that we've been hearing from the Biden administration. What's your take on that?
So TikTok, 170 million Americans enjoy TikTok, and there are businesses on TikTok. I'm very sensitive to this issue because I'm a dad, and I also know how popular TikTok is. But here's what's going on, and we strike the difference between, but they say, Congressman, you know, my data is out there on Facebook, or it's out there on Twitter or Instagram. True, but TikTok is run by a company called ByteDance, which is owned by China. And the Chinese Communist Party has a law. Every Chinese company has to comply with the Chinese national security law that says your data is our data. We tell you what to do, and that's unknown to most Americans. So the risk is not TikTok today. The risk is that TikTok is sending two things to China. One, pattern of life for 170 million users in the United States. And secondly, that means it's an instant ability to shift propaganda or shift weighting or messaging through their algorithm to the United States. So the bill does this. We ask that ByteDance divest TikTok in the United States. And if so, then an American company could buy TikTok, keep the data in the United States, control the algorithm, and you'd have another big data platform here. But connected directly to the Chinese Communist Party, you are putting Americans' data, cyber attack capabilities, and propaganda, I think at greater risk, and I supported the decision to vote to ask them to divest TikTok here in the U.S.
Yeah, so it's really trying to take that problem and not let it grow to the point.
Right, you're heading it off. And this is what I think a lot of people don't understand, and I respect the difference. They think, my gosh, I run my business on TikTok, or my kids enjoy it. But it's the capability there that we're trying to guard the country at large against. And I think that's where we put that bigger decision on behalf of the whole country ahead of maybe somebody's individual appreciation of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was interesting. Yesterday, of course, Governor Sanders came out, signed the executive order, basically kind of going against Biden's changes to Title IX. I thought it was interesting when she mentioned that, the original Title IX was only 36, 37 words long, and yet now we have this almost 500,000 page document that is supposed to rule what Title IX is now. What is your response to that? And do you think that Governor Sanders made the right call as far as directing educators to follow state law versus federal?
Right. I think the president's headed down the wrong track here. When I talk to moms and dads, they're concerned about the competitive advantages of a biological male who's a transgender female competing in girls' sports. There's a danger issue there: weight, size, muscle mass, capability. There's an anti-competitive view for it from a fairness point of view. So I think she's speaking on behalf of moms and families across the country as a mother to say that that's just not the right policy, that somehow this has to be handled in a different way. And letting biological males compete with girls in girls' sports just doesn't sit right or have any common sense associated with it, which is not to take anything away from someone who wants to be a transgender athlete, but there's got to be a better way to do it than let them compete head-to-head with girls in high school and college sports. That doesn't make any sense, and so I think she's speaking out on behalf of a really common view across this country, and I think President Biden is being too cute by half by trying to force this measure without an act of Congress down on the country. It's just another overreach, I believe, by the executive branch.
Have you seen that as a pattern since you've been in Washington? And from this administration, I've seen many complaints from Governor Sanders and others that Biden, if he can't get something through Congress, he tends to just put out these executive orders and tries to do it on his own.
This is a long-standing problem in both parties. It's hard to get consensus in our country on big issues. And what I mean by that is that there's enough consensus that you can pass a law in both the House and Senate, survive a presidential veto, and get a presidential signature. It's hard work. And when the founders created our country, they meant it to be hard work. And so presidents of both parties have tried to move around that by expanding the executive authority through an executive order. And the federal courts, for the most part, have struck those down. An executive order is meant to be directive by the executive. It's meant to be narrowly tailoring perhaps a law's focus, and those have been permitted. But President Obama on DACA, the deferred action for kids that were brought to the United States by illegal parents, the DACA kids, or the student loan effort, yes, the courts are saying you can't do that. So this is a pattern of the Biden administration, but it's been a creeping problem, I think, through American government for the past 30 years. I'm opposed to it. I think we ought to recognize that both parties of both presidents should work with Congress to get consensus on some of these tough issues, and not exceed their authority, their Article 2 authority, when Article 1, which is the Congress, the legislative authority, should remain paramount.
Yeah. And of course, coming to the topic of authority, I think a lot of folks in Arkansas are talking about the ATF right now, the Malinowski case, what happened there as far as, what is legal gun sales, what is not, what makes you a federal firearms dealer, what makes you a hobbyist and just a citizen. That particular raid, I think, raised a lot of concerns for gun owners in Arkansas. What has been the talk in Washington about this case, and do you see it making even further headlines when it comes to how the ATF manages their cases?
Well, I have concerns about federal overreach in these kind of cases, period. And it can be a white-collar case, which I consider this in some ways, or something even more overtly criminal. I think we need to use better judgment when we're conducting search warrants. I think there's absolutely no reason, in my view, as a citizen and as a member of Congress, to see someone, armed people, go in and to conduct a search warrant at 6 a.m. for a person who has a 9-to-5 job as a public official. He's the airport manager. They could have gone by his office and said, "Come with us to your home. We're going to execute a search warrant." And so it was shocking. Secondly, it's clear, and they've now acknowledged, they weren't wearing body cam on an ATF raid. Directly contrary to an executive order, speaking of executive orders, of Joe Biden, where that would be a good executive order. I, the president, direct my federal agents who are conducting any kind of federal operation to wear body cams. They didn't do it. So I think that's very concerning to me. So process, the actual tactical action, and that's why I asked Jim Jordan, who's the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, to investigate this. I thought it deserved strong legislative oversight by the Congress. It's just exactly what Americans don't want to see in their federal government.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you see any further movement in that case, or anything else coming down the line whenever it comes to the ATF?
Well, Chairman Jordan has asked them very specific questions about the operation. When he gets those answers, that could prompt some interviews of ATF by Chairman Jordan, a hearing on this topic, or connect this topic to another hearing. So I think you'll see Jim Jordan, our Judiciary Committee, follow up on this. It's a pattern that we're seeing, and Congress doesn't like it. And so I was, like I say, I'm very sad for Brian, who I knew. He'd just been in Washington the week before advocating for Clinton National Airport to the congressional delegation, and we're all shocked by this. And I hope that between the investigation here in Little Rock and the investigation in Congress, we get to the bottom of what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Also talking about a little bit the border crisis. Of course, we've got about an estimated 40 Arkansas Guardsmen that are at the border right now, assisting Texas. What are your thoughts on that?
The border's been a challenge for years, and we've had a policy for the past 30 years of increasing fencing and barrier, expanding our ports of entry, increasing training, increasing surveillance, both aerial surveillance and tower surveillance. That's been going on since the 1990s. But President Trump worked very hard with Mexico and with our Border Patrol to reduce this flow. And unfortunately, when President Biden was sworn into office, he did away with all the Trump policies that were working. And this has been the fight for 3 years. And we've seen an unprecedented number of 7 million encounters across the border, 1 million gotaways that we don't know where they are, most of whom are seeking asylum. Well, you cannot seek asylum in the U.S. So President Biden is waiving them in under parole, or waiving them in under his executive authority to seek asylum here. I think that's a terrible idea, and that's why the House passed a bill called H.R. 2 that would reform the immigration system and then reform the border security matter. We passed it. We don't have any action out of the Senate on it. But all that to say, President Biden could correct this through the same ways that he messed it up, by reversing those policies that are clearly hurting the border. Just this week, I announced that I've commissioned with Mike Turner, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and Mark Green, the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, an investigation using the General Government Accountability Office, the GAO, to investigate why Transportation Security Authority, TSA, doesn't work with our intelligence agencies and Homeland Security and the Border Patrol on the people on the terror watch list. This is very concerning to me.
Yeah.
They say to us, some 300 people have been on the terror watch list that have been encountered at the border during the Biden administration. Well, where are they? You encountered them, but did you let them in the United States? Were they deported? Have they been arrested? Show me the disposition. We got zero answers.
Wow.
In classified hearings or unclassified hearings. So we've written this letter to GAO to investigate this for us, and with the power of the Intelligence Committee and the Homeland Security Committee, I think we'll get answers. We've got to keep the America safe, and an open southwest border doesn't do that. I've been in Congress 9 years. I've been to the border 9 different times, doing analysis on exactly what we need to do. And honestly, Joe Biden's done everything exactly wrong. Exactly wrong. And it took President Trump 4 years to get it where it was working right. And it wasn't perfect then. But President Biden has created a border catastrophe that's put the American people at risk for fentanyl, for drugs, for smuggling, for human trafficking. And as I say, very concerningly, unknown numbers of people on the terror watch list getting in the country.
Yeah. That makes a good point. I think without that, communication between those departments, how do you know exactly what's going on there? And also, when it comes to the border crisis, we've seen, all these migrants being bussed into different cities
Right.
across, the country in order to, restart their lives there. Do you see those migrants coming to Arkansas? Or are they already here, or what's the situation in
I'm
our
sure
state?
there's some that are here. What happens when you cross that border and you've been interviewed by, let's assume things are working, you've been interviewed by the Customs and Border Patrol agent, you've been vetted, you've filled out a form, you've had your name run through the computer system, and you say you're seeking asylum because you're afraid of going back to your home country for death. We will admit you into the country for a certain number of days pursuant to this asylum request to see a federal judge, and you tell us where you want to go. So when people cross the border, they say, I want to go to Boston. Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, is not like sending people to New York because they don't want to go to New York. They're asking to go to New York. And Greg Abbott is expediting their visit to the city because they have a connection there. You're supposed to tell the federal judge, here's where I'll be, here's my number, my cell phone number, here's my point of contact in the U.S., and I will appear in court. The problem is that doesn't happen. And we don't deport these people, and we don't have an adequate follow-up. And that's why the law says you can seek asylum in the United States from a third country, not be paroled into the country to wait. That is not the way the system's built, and that's created this flow because people know if they go to the border and they pay someone, a coyote, $7,000 to cross the border in cash or agree to work it off once they're in the United States, that they won't be deported under this administration. What President Trump said is we're going to deport criminal aliens that have a felony. We're going to tell people they must seek asylum from a third country, and we're not going to permit you doing that in the United States. That was his, what he called, remain in Mexico policy, and the Mexicans partnered on that. And we're going to increase enforcement along the border through building the wall, the fencing, increase the staffing, and then we're going to increase immigration judges so that we speed those asylum claims that are in the country. That was the Trump plan. That was the plan that Joe Biden and his secretary, Mayorkas, abandoned. For what reason is inexcusable, but that's what happened.
Yeah. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else to ask you. I think we pretty much summed up everything. Well, also just the college protests we've been seeing across the country. Haven't seen too much here in Arkansas. There's been a few here and there. What's been your response to seeing those protests?
Well, look, dissent is important. A First Amendment right is one of the great traditions, and the freedom to assemble and the freedom to petition your government. These are all our First Amendment rights, which we prize here. But as a student on a college campus or a visitor to a college campus, you have the rules of that campus. And I believe the first line of defense of proper etiquette and behavior here is the faculty and trustees of that campus. Next, the city in which it's located, or the county, or the state. And this is broken down incredibly inappropriately. And I believe that the universities have failed their students to craft a safe place for someone to protest, but also the safety of the students. These students, Jewish students in some of these campuses are being attacked. They're being harassed. They're being blocked from buildings. They're being attacked on their own campus just a few days away from graduation or from a final exam. And there's no place for that. I noted as we tape this, reading in the news clips overnight, that of all the arrests at Columbia University in New York City, for example, the vast majority were not even students.
Wow.
What are they doing on campus? So I believe that we need to hold these presidents of these universities and the Board of Trustees accountable here first, then the metropolitan and state authorities. You saw this in the 60s. I think President Reagan was then governor at California, Berkeley, and set a high standard for, sure, First Amendment's okay, but we're not going to have violence here. And there have been other instances through our history on that. So I want to see the First Amendment protected, but I want anti-Semitism, violence, harming other students stopped.
Yeah.
And that's why we've been so outspoken on that in the House.
Yeah. I guess just the last question, just to sum everything up, of course, it being an election year, we've got a presidential election coming up, and I'm curious what your thoughts are as far as the feelings in Washington. Of course, we know that we live in a very divided country right now when it comes to ideologies and politics. What do you see as far as the challenges for the Republican Party coming up in this presidential election?
Well, in my view, President Biden is the most unpopular president in American history going into a presidential election year. It's going to be very challenging for him because of the border policy we talked about, number one. But number two is his economic policies that have produced or contributed to, I'll say that, contributed to this incredible inflation. Once you lose your purchasing power, you don't get it back. So that 18% difference between January 21 and today that our families are feeling, they're going to remember that in November. But with that said, President Trump has high unfavorable ratings too among many voters. So it's a tough presidential election year. For Republicans in the House, we believe that we can actually add seats in the House, and I base that on because we won in blue districts in 2022 and in 2020. So when President Biden defeated President Trump in 2020, the House picked up seats, and we picked up seats in 2022. I believe that we'll hold those seats in New York and California in blue districts, and that we'll win seats in other states. So I expect the House to do well for the Republicans, and I think the Senate has an opportunity to be Republican. So it's going to be a fascinating year, but running as a Republican, I want to get back to economic growth, less regulatory burden on our small businesses. We want our banks to be healthy and well capitalized and out lending. We want to tame inflation. We want to get the border secure. We want to lead in the world and not lead from behind, which I would argue President Biden has done in Afghanistan, Ukraine, Syria, Iran. All those situations have become worse under the Biden administration, and we need that American leadership at home and abroad.
Yeah. Any comment on any of the current criminal cases that former President Trump is dealing with, and how that might affect the campaign?
Yeah, well, I think that's a big issue during the campaign, that he faces these suits, federal suits and state suits in New York and Georgia. And I'm not a lawyer, so I won't play one here with you. But I have concerns about the origins of some of them. But I think it's definitely going to dominate the campaign. I don't see those suits going away. And I think the president's going to be tied up defending himself for a great deal of this campaign year.
Yeah. All right. French Hill joining us here on Channel 7 News to give us an update on what's going on in Washington. Thank you so much, French. We appreciate it.